There's a few topics on my mind today that I want to discuss. Um, the first topic is sort of the personal nature of one's spiritual journey, the process of awakening, repeated awakening until complete liberation. These awakening experiences can be quite personal to every person, so I want to discuss that first, maybe just for a couple minutes. And then spend more time on the main topic of this video, which is Plato's Allegory of the Cave and the Socratic method that Plato discussed, branching off that allegory, and then the Buddha's first teaching, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, after his awakening experience. And the reason I want to discuss those two topics is because the overarching theme of this video is in communicating the communication of what I call ultimate reality, what the Buddha called the unconditioned, and what there's different names for in every religion. And right off the bat, just the fact that these types of words, we have no control over how they're understood by who we're communicating them to. And so I want to use those two examples to, one, try to clarify what I mean when I talk about ultimate reality, and also how both Plato through Socrates, or Socrates through Plato, however you want to think of it, tried to communicate what he learned in his enlightenment, and the Buddha in his own enlightenment, and things like that. So it's enough for introduction. So first of all, the personal nature of awakening, it's pretty connected to the topic that I want to discuss, which is that whatever sets a person on the path of awakening, it can be extreme suffering, or it could be a profound realization. And the character of that experience and the language that that experience is interpreted into largely determines how we communicate that experience, and what we feel and experience along the way in the form of insights and awakenings. So for me, in the past few videos, I've been using the term ultimate reality to explain what I have been experiencing. And that can be confusing to some people if it is heard as the concept of an absolute stable thing outside of the experience you're having now, that you're then able to grab onto and obtain. But the reason that I tend to use that word is because it has deep resonance for me in my own experience, in my journey. And what I've been going through in the past couple of days relates to that as well. So I've mentioned the various experiences of awakening that I've had in my life, and for me, those have always been accompanied by this sensation or this thought that I've always just used the term ultimate reality. I wasn't raised in a religious context, and it was a sense that all of the unreal was gone. So I've always called it that. And so that phrase has deep resonance for me, whereas for other people, a word like God might have deep resonance with that experience of the mind becoming crystal clear and seeing things in a very truthful way. So essentially what I mean when I say that is the mind becoming crystal clear, seeing the world as it is rather than as our ignorance and desire projects the world to be. That's the best way I can explain it in short right now. I think this will become more clear when I get into Plato's Allegory of the Cave and the Buddha's teaching on the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, and why he chose that structure instead of just his original approach. And so recently, after this is the personal nature of my own journey here, and I don't want to dwell too much on this because I think it's more useful. It's very personal to me, so I'm not sure how useful it is to you, whoever's watching. But the first experience of awakening that set me on this journey, it wasn't so much an experience of deep suffering that set me on this journey. It was more of an experience of awakening that set me on this journey. And I spent about 3 years living a life from 15 to 18, of being sort of outside my society of high school because I had no interest in what other teenagers had interest in. I only had interest in just dwelling in this what I called ultimate reality of ultimate truth, true love, and true happiness is how I described it. I wrote about this constantly. Around age 18, though, I started to allow doubt to enter my mind when I started to just the various institutions, I won't go through the whole story, various institutions introduced doubt into my mind, and I've been sort of spinning with doubt for a long time ever since, up until that doubt ceased at Swanmuk. And because it was a Buddhist monastery, I adopted the language of Buddhism then after that. But even the language of Buddhism started to cause me to doubt that experience. But what happened a few days ago is I just kind of I happened upon a discussion of non-duality in Advaita Vedanta and the description of what the mind experiences or perceives in ultimate reality as Sat Chit Ananda. Sat is translated, I think, most often as limitless being, but often as ultimate truth, and then Chit as limitless consciousness, or the consciousness that doesn't depend on conditions, and then Ananda as limitless bliss. And at that moment, there was a sudden realization or recognition that my three characteristics of ultimate truth, true love, and true happiness corresponded perfectly with that, and it just dissolved all the doubt that I had in that experience. And there wasn't just one, it's dozens and dozens of experiences that I've had with what I've called ultimate reality my whole life, that have had those three characteristics. And so it just dissolved out. I thought to myself in that moment, if every other person who's had this experience describes the characteristics in exactly the same way, and then all the study I've done it all came into my mind all at once. And so for the past few days, I've been posting videos not in the structure of, without strict adherence to Buddhist thought, as I did in the first 7 videos I posted, but just allowing myself to kind of deliver my understanding spontaneously. But I don't want that to confuse people. And so I guess you can say that this video today is a little bit to give more context to those past few videos that I posted, and perhaps to set the stage for this integration of Buddhist and non-dual thinking that will probably dominate future videos. So the first topic here is Plato's Allegory of the Cave, because I kind of had an experience the other day that Plato's describing in this allegory. So if you're not familiar, in Plato's Allegory of the Cave, he describes, he poses a thought experiment. Imagine a group of people had been imprisoned in a cave their whole life, and they are shackled in such a way where they're facing the wall of the cave and their backs are towards, behind their backs there is a fire, and it's casting shadows on the wall in front of them. And periodically, people, animals, objects walk in front of that fire, and what these prisoners of the cave see are the shadows that are cast on the wall. And this is what they see their whole lives. And they become enchanted by the shadows. They become fascinated by the shadows. They become horrified by the shadows. They experience all of the range of human emotion based off these shadows. They get into arguments about the shadows. They make stories about the shadows. They worship the shadows. They hate the shadows. They create religions about the shadows. They create art about the shadows, let's say. All they do is talk about the shadows, right? So their whole reality is based off their perception of these shadows on the wall, and these shadows are cast by, people, animals, and objects that are passing in front of the fire. But the fire is behind them, and these people, animals, and objects are between the fire and them, so they don't see the people, they just see the shadows. But one day, one of these prisoners suddenly breaks free of his shackles and just stumbles outside the cave into the world of sunlight, the sunlit reality, right? And he sees real trees, real people, real animals, real objects. And at first, when he goes out into the sunlight, it's so bright that he can't see anything. It's too bright, and perhaps he runs back into the cave. I think I'm probably adding a little bit to the story. Maybe he runs back into the cave, but then he gets enough courage to go back out into the sunlight, and he's seeing real objects out there. And his eyes adjust, and he gets used to it. And he decides one day, gosh, it's beautiful out here. I better go back in there to my fellows who are still locked in the cave and tell them, like, there's this world of reality out here. This is what the world really looks like. He's even, especially the sun, where the light is actually coming from. And he goes back into the cave, and he makes his way to where he was, where his companions are, and they're still in there just watching the shadows, talking about the shadows. And he, first of all, can't see very well in the cave anymore. It's very dim and dark, and the shadows can't enchant him anymore. He knows they're shadows. So he comes and he starts telling them, "Oh, hey guys, you guys are in prison. These are shadows. Their ultimate reality is out there. It's like this. This is what reality is like. This is what the ultimate reality is." Plato says that the prisoners of the cave would become afraid of him. They would become angry at him. They might even try to kill him because he's threatening their sense of reality, right? He's questioning the shadow play on the wall, which is their whole reality. So what Plato comes to the conclusion is that the ultimate reality that a philosopher realizes cannot be communicated as such, that you have to develop the method that Socrates used of patient questioning and answering in order to help the people who are still enchanted by the shadows to become disenchanted by them, and to become interested in ultimate reality, essentially. In Plato's context, it includes a metaphysics of ideal forms that I'm not going to get into right now. I'm more so going to connect this allegory to the Buddha and his methodology, which is a little different than the Socratic method, although he does use that. So you could say that the Buddhist method does predate the Socratic method, because there's plenty of suttas where he does a lot of questioning of people who have fixed ideas about things. So in the allegory, the shadow play is the realm of perception, and all of our beliefs and stories that we're enchanted by, and even the forms of perception, thought, feeling, sensation, and all of that's part of this perceptual system. And the ultimate reality is what's beyond that. But I'll get back to that. So the Buddha, after his awakening, now just transitioning to the Buddha, after his awakening, and I've had this experience many times, just going back to Plato, where I've had long or short moments where ultimate reality has outshined shadow play for me. And like I said, as a teenager, good 3 years of my life, and then after Swanmukh, 6 months, and then many dozens and dozens of times for shorter periods, days in between. And as I said in my previous video, every time the mind makes contact with reality, delusions are dissolved. But we have so many delusions and so many storylines and so many habits and so much conditioning that it takes repeated contact with reality to really uproot everything. But moving on to the Buddha now. The Buddha, after living his life, 29 years of his life, with all of the pleasures of the world, because he was, a prince living in a palace, or something like a prince, we'll say, at least of his particular area, living in something like a palace. His father gave him all the most beautiful women, all the best food. He was constantly surrounded by beautiful music. He was not allowed to see the world outside of pleasure, because his father was told that he was going to become either a sage or a ruler, and his father did not want him to become a sage. So he imprisoned him in bliss, or we'll say not bliss, pleasure, sensual pleasure. One day he saw he left the palace, or over the course of several days, he left the palace and saw somebody who was old, somebody who was sick, and somebody who was dead. This disillusioned him to the permanence of his sensuality, and then he saw a samana, a monk, and that showed him an alternative. So he entered the path, he shaved his head, and he left the palace. And he'd even had a wife and a young child at that time. And he spent 6 years going into another so he left the sensual realm, right? And then he went into 2 other realms, you can say. He went into the jhanic realm, where he practiced all of the deep states of meditation, from the 1st jhana to the 8th jhana, or he doesn't, anyway, I'm not going to get technical right now, but all of those deep states of meditation, still felt that didn't liberate him. Then he went through a life of practicing austerities, starving himself, harming himself. That didn't liberate him. And then finally, on the day of his awakening, he discovered what he called the middle way. He remembered 1st jhana from his childhood. He entered 1st jhana. He saw the process of dependent origination, the arising and passing of perception, how the world and the self are constructed through the process of perception. And he became disenchanted and then completely disillusioned to the world that the mind constructs and represents, and he became the Buddha. He woke up fully. At first, he didn't want to teach. He wanted to possibly just stay outside the cave and chill out in the sun and enjoy himself. But conventionally in the suttas, it says that he was invited by a deva, which is like a god or an angel, to teach the Dhamma. And so then he went off looking for his former companions, and on the way, you could say his first teaching attempt was a major failure. A man saw him and said, "Wow, you look amazing. What are you? Who are you? What have you realized?" And the Buddha just made this big proclamation, like, "I'm a self-awakened Buddha. I've realized the ultimate reality. I am the victorious one." Like, just this big proclamation of what he had discovered. And the dude was just like, "Oh, okay, yeah, sure, you're fucking crazy." Shook his head and walked off, right? So the Buddha, quick learner at this point, he's fully awakened. He's no longer Siddhartha Gautama. He is the Buddha. He's like, okay, that didn't work out. I'm going to try something different. So when he did find his 5 ascetics, he taught them the 4 Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path instead. So I'm going to use Plato's Allegory of the Cave here to explain this methodology that the Buddha chose to use. Because the one thing I want to repeat and I want you guys to remember throughout this video is that jhana, the 4 Noble Truths, Socratic method, non-dual practices, worship in other religions, all of these things are just a mean to an end. They're not the end itself. And in Buddhism, we tend to take the Buddha's teachings on the world of conditions and take that to be the only world that exists. And like, we think to ourselves that we just have to be like, kind of like, awakening is like just being okay with conditions or whatever. But I'll get to that in a second. So, first Noble Truth, I'll go through this relatively quickly. The truth of dukkha. The Buddha said there is dukkha, right? And that this dukkha needs to be understood. And then this understanding needs to be, like, you need to basically realize that you've understood it. So each Noble Truth has like 3 phases to it, basically. There's the seeing, and then there's the duty, and then there's the knowing that you've accomplished the duty. So for the first Noble Truth, it's seeing dukkha, seeing suffering or disturbance. Understanding it completely is to see from all sides is the way that he articulates this. to see it from all sides, and then to know that it's like really set in. So going to use this in Plato's Allegory of the Cave, and also the three perceptions kind of, or at least the first two perceptions, kind of fall under the first noble truth here. If it was the Buddha going back to talk to the people in the cave, and he was going to use the Four Noble Truths to liberate them, when he would go there with the first noble truth, is he would say to them, look, these are shadows. They are not satisfying. That's another translation of dukkha. Being in love with these shadows is suffering. The shadows are impermanent. They're flickering. Look at how they're flickering. Look at, they're insubstantial, like they're flat. Look, this is actually a wall. They're not real. Right? So that's the first noble truth, is that the shadows that we are in love with, all of the ideas in our mind, are unsatisfying. And all of the sensual pursuits and all of the ideal pursuits that we have are unsatisfying because they're inherently insubstantial, just like those shadows. And they're impermanent, right? They're dukkha, they're anicca. Second noble truth he taught was that there is an origination for this dukkha, which is craving, and he even identifies craving as a fire, and it has three forms: greed, hatred, and delusion, or wanting, wanting to get rid of, wanting to get rid of, and delusion. And then he says that this has to be abandoned. Craving has to be abandoned, and then you have to know that you abandoned it. So the doing of the duty is path, by the way, and then the knowing that you've done it is fruition, but I'm not going to get into that. So going back to taking the second noble truth into the cave, the Buddha would say, after he's done saying, like, look, these are unsatisfying shadows, they're impermanent, you shouldn't be in love with them, you should, trying to disenchant people from the shadows by telling them it's that they should see it as dukkha. Then he would say, turn around, look at the origin of the shadows. And so then the prisoners would turn around, they would see there's a fire there that's casting the shadows. And what do you want to do? You want to abandon or extinguish that fire, right? So he would say, turn around and put out the fires, right? Because once the fires are put out, the shadows go away. And the putting out of that fire and the vanishing of those shadows is the third noble truth, which is cessation, the dukkha nirodha, or even you can think of it as tanha nirodha, which is the cessation of craving. So putting out the fire of craving is because craving is the origin of dukkha. So really putting out dukkha, it's like throwing water at the shadows. You really need to throw the water on the fire. So you throw water on the fire and the shadows go away because they rose dependent on the fire, right? Or even, so you turn around and throw water on the fire. So then the shadows would be gone. And that's really the stage of disenchantment or dispassion that comes from seeing the cessation of craving and realizing the bliss of that desireless state, let's say. So the third noble truth, the Buddha says that you have to realize it, you have to notice it, because we're actually experiencing the cessation of dukkha and the cessation of desire constantly. And I've said this before, but the objects and the ideas that we chase in our lives and we think we get happiness from, we actually don't get happiness from those objects. We get happiness from the very brief cessation of desire that happens when you're about to get the object, or like right when you get it, right when it enters your hands, desire ceases. And if for a moment you experience true happiness, which is the cessation of desire, the absence of desire, not the cessation of desire, because even the non-arising of desire is bliss. So for a moment you experience true happiness, but you mistake the acquisition of that object or that idea for the cause of that happiness. But really what happens after you acquire an object is it inherently is insubstantial, it's already deteriorating, and so it doesn't bring any lasting satisfaction. And then so dissatisfaction comes back, dukkha comes back, and you want another object, whether it be material or ideal, like in your head, right? Whether it be for a car or for a relationship or a career, whatever it may be. It's always really a mental construct. It's always really a representation. So then he says, these are shadows, they're caused by this fire, put out that fire, now realize the absence of the fire. And then there's the fourth noble truth, which is the Noble Eightfold Path, and that is the way out of the cave, right? So now you have brought craving to a cessation, but there's still heat there. Fires are going to pop back up. You got to keep putting them out, or you take the Eightfold Path and you get the hell out of the cave, right? And you go out into the sunlight and you live in the ultimate reality permanently. So this is where some disagreement in modern Western Buddhism has arisen, that Western Buddhists tend to think that, and not just Western Buddhists actually, throughout a lot of Buddhism, just because it's hard and the people who experience it don't talk about it, and so the people who don't experience it say it doesn't exist, but the permanent eradication of craving and ignorance, and the permanent nibbana that follows, which is the attainment of arahatship, or of Buddhahood. That's the definition of a Buddha or an arahat. Really is the definition of an arahat, and what makes a Buddha unique from an arahat is their ability to teach. And that's one among many distinctions that makes a Buddha different than an arahat. But what's common between them is they live in complete reality. They don't see any shadows, and they have no ignorance or desire. They have no greed, hatred, or delusion in their mind ever arising again. But that's not something that we have to worry about, right? Because, as I mentioned in my video, the liberation equation, the duty of this moment is always to see dukkha and to nirodha that dukkha, to see the fire of craving and to extinguish it, to bring about this, and to realize the cessation, and to abide in that emptiness that comes from it. And then the mind will become deeply, deeply satisfied. So that was the Buddha's method. He didn't just come into the cave and say, he did at first, oh, there's the ultimate reality, right? He said, the shadows are fake. They're not satisfying. Turn around, put out the fire that's causing the shadows, realize the absence of the shadows, and then walk out of the cave. That's the Four Noble Truths. And he even discusses the 7 factors of awakening, faith, energy, investigation of qualities, things like that. Piti sukha, rapture and bliss. These are the things that you experience when you contact the unconditioned. So, pausing here to maybe define some terms, and if using Plato's Allegory of the Cave hasn't made this clear, that when I say ultimate reality, or when the Buddha talks about the unconditioned, or when I talk about my understanding of what the Buddha means with the unconditioned, neither of these things are things, by the way. So this is what I wanted to talk about. Not the 7 factors of awakening, but the way the Buddha summarizes dukkha is these 5 aggregates: this body, mind, form, feeling, perception, thinking, and consciousness, afflicted by clinging or identification, is suffering. Ultimate reality, or the unconditioned mind, is these 5 aggregates, unafflicted by clinging, not identified with. And so that's what I'm talking about. That's what emptiness is, right? It's the absence of craving and clinging. It's the absence of the ignorance and the delusion that craving and clinging comes from. It's an absence rather than it's not an extra thing you acquire. It's the revelation of what's already been there the whole time through the removal of the things that were plugging it up. The analogy that I use, or at least that I see in my mind when I think about the difference between the mind that is conditioned and the unconditioned awareness, is that the mind that is conditioned is like it's like we're living inside of a house that has heavy blankets over all of the windows, and there are 5 windows in this house representing the 5 hindrances of sensuality, of ill will, of drowsiness and sleepiness and laziness, restlessness and remorse, and skeptical doubt or indecisiveness. Those are the 5 hindrances, right? And those are fabricated by ignorance and craving, greed, hatred, and delusion, along with all 10 fetters. They're fabricated by that as well. Pulling down those curtains or those blankets from the windows allows the light of ultimate reality of true knowledge to enter the mind and frees the mind that mental darkness, now you can see what's in the house. You can see if there's any trash that needs to be cleaned up. But mostly what you see, if we're using this as a metaphor for jhana, is thinking and examining thought, or applied and sustained attention, rapture, bliss, and one-pointed or focused attention, essentially a flow state. But the point here is that um, the light that's allowed into the mind dispels the delusion that was in the mind before. Because when you, let's say you're actually in the dark house, you might be imagining ghosts, you might be imagining monsters, you might be imagining snakes. Let's say you touch a rope and you think it's a snake, you touch a broom and you think it's like a monster with crazy hair, you touch something wet and you think it's like the girl from The Ring dripping, and then the blankets come off and the light comes in and everything just becomes what it is. And all of the delusions that the mind had fabricated, and all of the fear and anxiety based off those delusions, all goes away. So when I talk about reality or nibbana as being the element of extinguishing, which is what the Buddha called it, he called it the deathless element, or the element of extinguishing. It's the cause of that extinguishing is the light of true knowledge, and the extinguishing itself is what the Buddha calls nibbana. So when light comes into darkness, it extinguishes all of the ideas that were dependent on that darkness, all of the misunderstanding and delusion that was dependent on that darkness, that mental darkness. And the absence of all of that is what we call emptiness. So these are all synonyms. And I said in another video that the 5 aggregates unafflicted by clinging, or this embodied mind without any identification, this whole world without any identification, is what the Buddha called atammayata. It's the experience of non-identification is one way of translating it. It's also translated as unconcoctability, which is again a synonym for the unconditioned. So it's this very mind, without all of the confusion, without all of the wanting, without all of the dissatisfaction. It's the same mind. So that's why it is profound, because most of us live our lives in this darkness, and we develop all of our desires and all of our fears from this darkness. And when I say ultimate reality, what I'm talking about is as I'm just describing what this mind feels like when it's completely clear, basically. So I hope that makes that clear. But if you turn ultimate reality into a concept, it will be a cause for suffering. If you turn nirvana into a concept, it will become a cause for suffering. If you turn God into a concept, it would be a cause for suffering. Anything that's turned into a concept is a cause for suffering. Because by definition, a concept is not this present moment awareness that you're having right now. Every tradition, whether from Buddhism to Vedanta to all the non-dual mystics of the past century, to even if you look closely at Christianity and other of those Western religions, and a lot of Western philosophy, they all point to exactly the same thing, that when we remove the hindrances, when we remove all of the hallucinations that the mind creates, what's revealed is an awareness that's already always been here. Now, my own experience of this, to go back to personal experience here, and hopefully for me, like, the doubt about this is what's been removed recently, because normally when I do have like an awakening like I had the other day, it lasts sometimes a couple hours, and then doubt comes back into the mind and drags me back into that mental darkness, or I get into a conversation with somebody who doesn't understand what I'm trying to say, and then that makes me doubt myself, and I go back. But that hasn't happened to me this time, and it's because that fetter of doubt has finally been dissolved. And so going back to just personal experience, because I'm kind of doing a mixture of sticking to Buddhist text and then also just being honest about my own personal experience to, as I said in the last video, aid anybody who's on this journey. because a lot of times I see myself reflected in others, and that helps me. But for me, my own experience of this is that there's a sense of universal mind. I've always called it, other than ultimate reality, I've always called it universal mind. In Zen, they talk about small mind and big mind. Small mind being the ego, and big mind being just the entire universe. And whether or not that's a metaphysical reality, it doesn't matter. And that's another thing I wanted to mention, is that whenever the Buddha speaks about these things, or non-dual teachers talk about these things, they're always speaking in terms of what's called phenomenology, which is your present moment experience, because that's the only thing you actually can talk about. It's really considered to be an illusion to think that we can talk about anything outside of consciousness, because whether we're talking about our first person experience or we're using the tools of science, even the tools of science are made in our own image, right? And so everything that's represented back to us is represented back to our perceptual system, right? So a computer's interface, the way it represents its data, is designed to make sense to the human perceptual system. It's not going to make sense to a chameleon, right? Computers that collect data from the universe, like galaxies, what you see, like pictures of galaxies, that's not what's actually out there. That's a computer-generated image that's structured and colored in a way that makes sense to human perception. So the point here is that whether you are a mystic looking deep inside your own mind to understand the constituents of perception and experience in order to see through the shadows, or you are an astrophysicist looking out at the cosmos, or you're a quantum physicist looking deep into elementary particles, you're only looking at consciousness and its contents. And that's the position the Buddha took, and that's the position that most non-dualists take, or non-dualism takes, is that you're always only looking at consciousness, because that's your only reference point for I mean, you just can't not. So that's another way that what I'm saying can be misunderstood, and what the Buddha says is misunderstood, is that it's never about anything outside of what can be experienced, because I mean, that ultimately just doesn't matter. And luckily, and the reason I always return to Buddhism, no matter how far I go off in these things, is because the Buddha gave us, well, he's not the only one, but for me personally, he gives us something very concrete and to like a litmus test for reality. When the mind makes contact with reality, suffering dissolves. That's the dukkha nirodha, right? The liberation equation, dukkha nirodha. He says this very clearly in the Kalama Sutra, when the Kalamas are asking him, like, all of these hundreds of spiritual traditions, all of these philosophers, how do we know what to believe? He says, don't believe me, don't believe them, don't believe what's said, don't believe, even if there's like a little group of people who have a guru that they think he knows everything, don't believe them, don't believe the masses, don't believe what's in text, blah, 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 blah. He goes through all kinds of stuff. He says, only when the teaching, if it equals the cessation of dukkha, essentially, he said, if it leads to greater compassion, more harmlessness, more happiness, basically, I'm paraphrasing, if it leads to these sublime states, the cessation of dukkha, more mental clarity, then you can take it to be true knowledge. So his criteria for true knowledge is experientially testable. So when you have an experience that makes you feel more confused, or when you learn something it makes you feel confused, then either it's false or it's communicated in a way that doesn't resonate with you. But this is another reason why the Buddha advocates for direct knowledge. So it's not just about language, right? Because as Jacques Derrida says in Deconstruction, we have no control over how our words are interpreted. All language has a multitude of possible interpretations, because words just depend on each other, right? If you were to just hold up a dictionary, all of the Buddha's teachings, all the teachings in the world are in that dictionary of your language, right? They're just words being defined by other words and referring only to each other. So as far as language goes, I have no control over how what I'm saying is being interpreted. When I say ultimate reality or the unconditioned, when I say truth, when I say any of these things, I have no control over how it's being interpreted. So what the Buddha tells his followers is that you know through direct knowledge, and by the effect of that direct knowledge, which is greater clarity, greater understanding, more compassion, more happiness, things like that. This is why I lost faith in Western philosophy, because so many of the Western philosophers were confused and miserable people, and true knowledge doesn't lead to that. But to illustrate this point is that I guess I'll just use the same example again. Well, yeah, I keep thinking of the same examples I've used before. But yeah, I'll just use the same example. You're a child in your bed. And maybe this is the first video you're watching, so you're not hearing this example again, but it bears repeating. When you were a kid and the room was dark and you were scared because you heard a tapping on the window, we'll say, and you thought that it was like a monster outside scratching the window, and you yell for your parents, and your mom comes in or your dad comes in and turns on the lights, and you see that it's actually just the branch of a tree scratching at the window, and the fear goes away instantly. And that's because in the darkness, your mind did not have true knowledge, so it took the sound and it manufactured a fiction of a monster scratching on the window. But when the light came on and you saw clearly that it was actually just the branch of a tree, the perception of the monster dissolved, and then the fear that was dependent on that perception dissolved too. So that's the effect of true knowledge. It has an instantaneous extinguishing of delusion and fear and craving and all of those things.